A confirmation about the audio, please. If the audio is clear and available, kindly confirm the same. Thank you. Mar Convention is basically the precursor to the Ramsar Convention. And Mar Convention was when for the first time the various luminaries, the scientists, etc., they ended up meeting and ended up deciding the role of importance of conservation of these marshes, wetlands, etc. And that is where from Mar conference up till a decade, the entire text was finalized, the context was decided, and that is when we actually came upon the Ramsar Convention, which was decided. Okay. So, hello, a very warm good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. Welcome to another session of Environment and Ecology. Now, in the past session or in the last weekend, we actually discussed about the basics of ecosystem. What do we understand by the biotic, abiotic factors? We then took a look, a detailed analysis about the factors when we talk about the abiotic as well as biotic factors, and how is it that the abiotic factors, when they end up changing, what are the various different adaptations that are indicated by the species. So there we saw amongst the various different adaptations, migration, suspension, and in suspension we looked at the different types of suspension, confirm, regulation, and also then we looked at the various different types of population interactions which are caused. Now, after that, we initiated a discussion about the ecological pyramids and what is the role played by ecological pyramids when they indicate to us about a sustenance and sustainability of any particular ecosystem. Now, after that, we started looking at the portion of ecological succession, that how is it that in a particular place, how is it that you have the genesis of species which happens, and how is it that various different species they do come into existence. Now, after that, we also looked at the portion of the biomes. What do we understand by biomes? Where we saw that various different areas, they are classified based upon the various types of vegetation, and that is basically classified depending upon the type of climatic conditions which are experienced. Now, the different types of climatic conditions experienced in various areas, they not only end up representing the various different types of vegetation which will grow, that is the plant types which will grow, but also the adaptations that the various animals and the plants they undertake in order to adjust in that changing environmental ecosystem. Now, after that, we started taking a look at the wetlands. We understood what these wetlands are, we understood the role played by the wetlands. In the meanwhile, we also looked at the aquatic ecosystem. How is it that the productivity of the aquatic system is actually determined? Then we looked at the portion of eutrophication. What do we understand by eutrophication? Where we saw that sometimes the aquatic ecosystem gets overloaded with nutrients, and that overloading with nutrients is referred to as the aquatic, or what is referred to as the eutrophication. Now, eutrophication can oftentimes lead to a harmful algal bloom, which provides a unique coloration pattern to the various different types or the various different kinds of um, harmful algal bloom. Also ends up creating issues such as the depletion of dissolved oxygen, creation of dead zones, and also there's a significant amount of foul stench which is emitted from the water bodies due to the rate of decomposition carried out. Now, after that, we had looked at the features such as red tides. We had also taken a look at the Ramsar Convention. We had understood that Ramsar Convention has got its highest level of decision making body, which is referred to as the Conference of Parties, the role of the Conference of Parties, and then the Conference of Parties ends up meeting every 2 to 3 years. Now, Here we had seen the list of the various different Ramsar sites, the updated list of the Ramsar sites in India. As of now, we have close to around 75 Ramsar sites in the country, but then it keeps on increasing year after year. So this is where I would always suggest to you and recommend to you that please take a look into the latest developments and the portion of the current affairs before you are approaching the exam hall. Always advisable to take a look at the latest editions and the regions where these Ramsar sites have been declared for a better understanding for the type of questions which can be framed. Now, government has basically ended up initiating a kind of a program which we refer to as the or which is referred to as the Amrit Dharohar scheme. Amrit Dharohar scheme. That Amrit Dharohar scheme has basically been brought about in order to increase or in order to bring about a protection and a large scale conservation of the coral ecosystems. Now, what is it that we are going to cover today? So, today we are going to initiate the discussion from mangroves. We are going to understand the role played by the mangroves, the various different types of adaptations that the mangroves go through, the Global Alliance for the Conservation of Mangrove, which has been formed very recently, and also the threats and the benefits played by the mangrove ecosystem. And then we will also be graduating into the portion of corals, the different types of corals that we have, what are the various different associations of features when we talk about the corals, what is biorock technology. So those portions of current affairs also we shall be analyzing when we are taking a look at the portion of the corals. And then we are going to take a look into the biogeochemical cycles, that is the sedimentary cycle, the gaseous cycle, and then eventually we will move into the portion of pollution. So we start with the portion of mangroves. Nocturnal species are basically the species which are active at night. That is what is referred to as nocturnal species. In order to conserve their energy during the day, many of the species they are active only during the night, and these are the nocturnal species. Was that your doubt, Kishan? Or was there some other doubt involved? So that is what is meant by the nocturnal species. Now, here when we talk about mangroves, overall, if you will observe this particular image, you will come across a finding that significant portion of these particular special kind of trees. Now, these are special kinds of vegetation which grow in coastal landscape and coastal areas. Okay. Now, in many of the cases, they are partially submerged underwater. Ideally, when you take a look at any particular tree, when it is grown or when it is present in any region which is saturated with water, when it is overflowing with water, that tree also starts to die because the tree requires the availability of oxygen as well. When you have any plant or any tree, through the root nodules, the trees or the roots of the trees and the plants, they take in oxygen, the oxygen which is trapped in the soil. So that is why natural and normal conditions will observe a kind of a tree which is growing in, let's say, oversaturated region where the water is accumulated, the trees end up dying. But the mangroves are certain specific species which have gone through adaptations to be able to grow in these submerged conditions. And these submerged conditions, they end up providing the ideal landscape for the growth of mangroves. Mangroves are very, very important for the ecosystem overall because not only do they increase the green cover of a particular area, and whenever you have a green cover in a particular region, that is always going to be helpful and beneficial for the growth of various different biodiversity support, and various different types of species will find their habitations and shelter here. Also, this green cover ensures a greater amount of carbon dioxide absorption, right? So they help in carbon dioxide or the greenhouse gas absorption, because the carbon dioxide that we end up emitting into the atmosphere, they need to be taken away in order to maintain the cooling of the atmosphere. And that is done by the various different trees and mangroves, because they have a higher density of leaves in general as compared to the thickness of them. So that is why they end up carrying out a greater amount of carbon dioxide absorption as well. So we shall be taking a look at the various different utilities, the functionalities, the benefits of the mangroves, and also the threats associated with them. But first of all, let us try to understand the various different adaptations that these mangrove ecosystems they undertake. So for example, when we talk about the adaptations, these are the modifications that they undertake or they undergo in their body morphology. What are the modifications? One is the presence of pneumatophores. What are these pneumatophores? So understand that with the help of a schematic diagram. So suppose here, let's suppose you have a thin mangrove vegetation. Let's suppose this is the soil. Let's suppose here you have the various roots and the root systems. Now, in the case of the mangroves, we have seen that they are saturated in water. That is, they are submerged in water. Significant amount of submergence in water is observed. So in this case, the roots, they don't get adequate access to oxygen. So here, as the roots are submerged in water, they do not get access to oxygen. So what is it that they do? In order to have that access to oxygen, let's suppose here you have the roots. Now these roots will grow certain nodules which will start propping up above the ground surface. Okay, so the roots, they develop nodules which prop up above the ground surface to provide them access to oxygen. Protruding root nodules to provide oxygen. Now, these protruding root nodules, they are referred to as pneumatophores, and it is these protruding root nodules which allow these particular plants to be growing even areas where it is particularly muddy. Because when you have a muddy region, and you would also have experienced this based upon your day-to-day interactions, where you would have also seen that when you have a normal soil, a drier soil, so there it is still air which can be trapped inside the soil. But when we talk about the muddy or the marshy soil, so when you press that marshy or muddy soil, you will observe that water is something which comes out rather than air. So that is where it allows these particular types of mangroves to grow in these muddy and marshy conditions. So these are protruding root nodules to provide oxygen and allows the plants to grow in muddy and marshy conditions. Then after that, we have viviparity. What is viviparity? That is a methodology by which they reproduce. So when we talk about viviparous mode of reproduction, what is it? So understand this first of all, why it is needed. So here, earlier we have seen that these mangroves, they are rather submerged. They are submerged in water. Now, imagine if normal conditions of or the normal trees would have existed. The normal trees, what they do is their seeds and the fruits, they drop down into the soil And that is how the new root or the new sapling germinates in the normal condition. But in the case of submerged plants, that cannot be a methodology of reproduction, because if these were to be dropped right into the water would simply carry it away, leading to a failed reproduction technique or a failed germination. So that is why, in order to adapt to that, what the plants end up doing is, let's suppose you have a particular coral, or rather the mangrove species, which is present in submerged conditions of water. Here you have the roots, let's suppose. Now, in this case, the newer sapling will always end up growing attached, still attached to the main stem. This is where the newer sapling starts to grow. And when it becomes significantly or substantially larger in size, that is when the newer saplings will automatically drop into the water or into the soil, and that will allow it to germinate. So it is a methodology of germination where the new ones or the new species, they are allowed to breed on the existing main stems themselves. That is what is referred to as viviparity. Then we have the salt secreting glands. Now, this is another methodology of adaptation that is indicated by the various different types of mangroves. And why is it that these mangroves require salt secreting glands? So, it is a very basic principle involved here. Let us try to understand that. So, when we have any particular plant, consider any plant for that matter, the normal conditions. Now, those plants will have leaves. Now, in the leaves, in the plants, you would have encountered that the leaves have the various different pores, isn't it? And through those pores, the leaves end up losing significant amount of water, right? What is this process referred to as? Through which the leaves end up losing water into the atmosphere. What is that process referred to as? That is very good. That is what is referred to as transpiration. So that is how the normal plants, they end up losing significant amount of moisture through their leaves and the leaf air interaction. But when we talk about the corals, now, or rather when we talk about the mangroves, pardon me for that, whenever we talk about the mangroves, now these mangroves are growing in saline water. Why saline water? Because they are growing generally in the coastal ecosystem. And in the coastal ecosystem, you have the presence of salt water, you have the sea and or the ocean, and that is where you have significant amount of presence of salt water. Now, when the roots, they will take in that salt water, the leaves will also get salt water as a result, isn't it? The leaves will also get that salt water. And when that, if it would have been a normal leaf, and then it would have carried out transpiration through the pores. Now, transpiration would be the loss of water, isn't it? But then, whenever you have saline water which evaporates, it is only the water which is lost. Salt is something which is retained, right? So that is where, because the mangroves, they end up growing in saltwater conditions, so that is why, in order to get rid of that excess amount of salt, the leaves have the salt secreting glands, particularly in their bottom portion. Otherwise, imagine if it would have been a normal leaf, all that saline water or salt water would have come to the leaf, the water would have evaporated, leaving behind the salt, which would have blockaded all the pores, and any future interaction in terms of gaseous exchange, etc., would be completely inhibited. That is why the garden plants that you see there, if you put saline water or salt water, they start to die very quickly because the leaves, they get blocked. So in order to get rid of that problem, the leaves have the salt secreting glands in order to get rid of the salt which is present in the saline water. Okay. In order to get rid of the salt which is present in the saline water, the leaves have these glands where the salts tend to accumulate in the bottom portion and they eventually drop. Okay. So the salts accumulate in the bottom portion of these leaves through the glands. Okay. And then those salts are returned back to the environment. That is basically the role played by these salt secreting glands overall. Then, uh, you said mangrove is growing in saline water, then how Bay of Bengal is famous for? So, Bay of Bengal, my dear friend, has got saline water. Salty water is present. So that is why in the deltaic stretches you will always find lot of mangroves. It is not always the case that it will only grow in salty water. It can also grow wherever you have lot of marshy and muddy conditions. Even if there is a fresh water, there also they can grow. But typically larger proportion of mangroves you will always find to be growing in these salt water or basically the coastal ecosystems. And coastline will always have the presence of salt. Is that clear? Is that understood? Or is there a doubt which prevails? Let me know. So that is basically about the salt secreting gland. So this is another method of adaptation. Then we have adventitious roots. This is again in order to provide, and this solves two purposes. In order to provide the strength to the mangroves and also in order to provide an access to oxygen. Because again, I will take you back to this particular image. In any of the mangrove that you see, you will be observing that the stems and the trunks, they are very, very thin. And in the coastal environment, you will have a frequent tidal movement, wave movement, etc., which can weaken the structural integrity of the plants, due to which the plants can actually fall down. So, what do we understand when we talk about adventitious roots? So, adventitious roots overall basically mean, let's suppose you have a mangrove, a thin one. Now, in order to provide support to it, you will observe that you have root ones which will protrude above the ground, and that forms the roots. Okay. So these are what are referred to as adventitious roots. That is why in mangroves in general, you will find that it has got a greater kind of a bushy nature above the water surface as well. It has a kind of a feature where it will appear like lot of twigs, lot of branches. They are supporting one main tree. So this is to provide strength to the plants and also access to oxygen. Adventitious roots, by the way, is not only something which is restricted only to the mangroves. Adventitious roots you will also end up finding in the region of What? In the region of, for example, if you have observed a banyan tree, banyan tree also has got many adventitious roots. As the tree gets older, as the tree gets much more denser, it needs that support, and that is why it has got that presence of adventitious roots. Okay. Now after this, we come to the portion of the various different ecosystem services provided by the mangrove ecosystem. So as I already told you, mangroves are very, very beneficial, very, very helpful for the coastal ecosystem, for the general environment as well. Why? First of all, if we analyze each one of them, so they carry out the significant amount of coastal protection. So in the coastline, across any particular coastline, if you have the presence of lot of these mangroves, then basically the impact of, let's say, a storm surge or a kind of even a tsunami, that is significantly moderated, and you don't have that large scale destruction which is caused because it forms a kind of a coastal barrier. So a kind of a coastal barrier is created. Okay, that coastal barrier is created. Now this was for the first time observed in large scale impact when we had the very devastating tsunami which occurred close to around 20 years ago, and that was the 26th December 2004, what we refer to as the basic what was the Indian Ocean tsunami, which ravaged the many portions of southern Asia and South Asia in general, where what was observed is that basically when we talk about, let's say, any particular area, now in that area, if the tsunami occurs, and what was experienced was that across the coastline of the country, the eastern coastline of the country, there were almost all the various areas which were exposed to it, the tsunami were completely destroyed. Now, immediately in the aftermath of tsunami, you did not have much of a communication system which could be established. So the assumption was that when we talk about the island ecosystem would have been completely ravaged. And the thought process was that Andaman Nicobar Islands, nothing would have been left in Andaman Nicobar Islands because that is very close to the occurrence of the earthquake which initiated that tsunami. But later upon, when actually rescue teams went upon to the region of Andaman Nicobar Islands, they found that Andaman Nicobar Islands did not suffer that great amount of destruction as compared to the remaining portions of the coastal part of eastern India. And that was purely because in these Andaman Nicobar Islands across the coastline, natural growth of mangroves, they provided a kind of a shield. And that modified, or that in a way reduced the impact of these large tsunami waves which could be created. So these coastal protection, they will provide you a kind of a protection from the tsunamis. They will provide you a kind of a protection from even storm surges. Okay, is this a slide that you were talking about, Gulam? Can we artificially create mangrove at our whole coastline? Yes, the plantation of mangrove, Kunal, can be carried out across the entirety of the coastline. Okay. Now, after this, another role played by the mangroves is that of water filtration. They filter out the heavy contaminants present in the water. How is it done? So we know that these mangroves, they have a very intense process or very intense network of root systems which are present. Very intense network of root system. So whenever you have a heavy contaminant which is coming from inland into the sea, now those heavy contaminants are trapped by the root ecosystem, and only the cleaner water is allowed to merge into the coastal area. So they provide a kind of a water filtration, and thereby in those areas where you have significant amount of roots underwater, there is a large amount of biomass which is also produced by these roots. Anywhere where you have organic matter in the inside water, that organic matter will produce some or the other biomass, and that is beneficial for the fisheries. So various different types of aquaculture activities, that is basically carried out. Various different types of aquaculture activity, in the sense pisciculture, that various different fishes, prawns, etc., shrimps, they are actually encouraged to grow in that region. So this is what increases the biodiversity or is beneficial for biodiversity. Significantly beneficial for biodiversity. Viviparity is a method or a mode of reproduction. Now, the mangrove ecosystems, they also provide a boost to the tourism sector and the tourism industry. When you take a look at the tourism industry, let's suppose in the region around Sri Lanka, now there is a large scale of this mangrove tourism which is carried out, where people are taken into these depth of these mangrove forests. So that is where tourism is also benefited. And the climate regulation by storage of excess amount of carbon dioxide. So as compared to the normal tropical forest that we have, this has got 3 to 5 times greater amount of carbon dioxide storage, because the amount of density of leaves in general is much larger. Overall, they provide livelihood support to close to around 120 million people globally and worldwide by the various different services that they end up providing. So mangrove ecosystem are very, very beneficial. In India, where is it that you find these mangroves? In India, you find the mangroves almost across the entirety of the coastline. One of the largest stretches of mangroves in India is to be found in the region of Sundarbans. Sundarbans. Now, Sundarbans is a deltaic region which has been created by the large rivers of Ganga and Brahmaputra. And in these Sundarbans, you have, and the name also is associated with these mangroves itself. Because in these Sundarbans, you have a very specific kind of a mangrove which grows, and that is what is the Sundari tree. Sundari tree. Now, that Sundari tree is based upon which the Sundarbans has been named. Okay. It is not climate replacement, it is climate regulation. Climate regulation means that they are able to regulate the warming by providing some degree of cooling, because these mangroves, they end up absorbing significant amount of carbon dioxide, because the trees will absorb carbon dioxide, isn't it, in order to carry out photosynthesis. So greater the proportion of leaves per tree, greater will be the absorption and storage of carbon dioxide, and that is done by the mangroves. That is why climate regulation is carried out. So across the entirety of the coastal ecosystem of the country and the coastline of the country, you will come across the presence of this mangrove population. So be it the Sundarbans or the Krishna Godavari Delta or the Kaveri Delta, or across the western coastline, or across even the island regions, you will come across the mangroves. But are the mangroves only restricted to the coastal environment? The answer is no. Even when we talk about large inland water bodies and around large inland accumulated water bodies, there also you will observe the growth of certain types of mangroves. So mangroves are not to be restricted only in the coastal environment. Wherever you have marshy and muddy conditions, natural propagation will always allow the growth of mangroves in that area. Now, what are the threats that these mangroves faces, or the dangers that the mangroves end up facing? So first of all, if you take a look at it, then logging or deforestation in order to have access to wood, that is one of the significant areas due to which that mangrove population is being lost. Then you have the agriculture, expansion and extension of agriculture. As we will study later on, that one of the basic reasons for deforestation anywhere across the world, one of the large scale reasons of deforestation anywhere across the world, is the extension of agriculture. So large areas under mangrove vegetation, they have been cleared, and the patch has been cleared in order to grow crops. So that is what is agriculture. Then you have aquaculture. Aquaculture basically causes more than half of the mangrove loss globally. Why? Because in order to grow shrimps, in order to grow prawns and fishes, there is an unsustainable environment and unsustainable harvesting of these species, and that ends up impacting the base of the mangroves, where the mangroves eventually they fall down upon. So aquaculture, agriculture, or in basis the food production. Then pollution is where you have the solid waste which is dumped, solid waste which accumulates in the region of the mangroves. Now they will in a way inhibit any kind of supply of oxygen to the roots. And this also includes the coastal marine spills, marine oil spills that you have, where in the coastal environment, let's suppose there has been an accident and lot of oil has been secreted. So that oil forms a thick layer, and it can provide a kind of a stifling of oxygen. The oxygen supply is not attained. Then coastal development. This includes infrastructure building. Whenever it is carried out, that will always end up damaging the natural ecosystem. For example, if you build a lot of infrastructure in, let's say, the island regions, there also there will be a significant detrimental impact which will be observed. So that is where the coastal development and infrastructure building brings about encroachment and brings about the depopulation of mangrove. Then climate change brings about a sudden change in sea level, isn't it? Now, that change in sea level is never going to be beneficial. In many of the regions, the sea level is consistently rising, submerging the areas where the mangroves could grow earlier. Because mangroves, after all, they are not aquatic species. Mangroves, basically, they end up growing in a kind of an ecotone of sorts. So, had they been aquatic species, even in completely submerged conditions, they could have grown. But that is not the case. So that is why when the sea level rises beyond a proportion, the mangroves won't be able to grow. Agriculture basically refers to the point of agriculture in the brief, refers to the fact that due to extension of agriculture to bring more and newer areas under agriculture, you have massive deforestation of mangroves and clearing of the mangrove patches, which is done. Okay, so that is basically about the threats posed to the mangroves. Now, in order to conserve these mangroves and protect these mangroves, the government has, in this particular year, in 2023, government has also launched the Amrit Dharohar scheme in 2023 in order to do what? In order to provide a kind of protection to the wetland. And here, in order to provide protection and conservation to the mangroves and increase the area under mangrove vegetation, the government in 2023, that is in February 2023, they launched the Mishti scheme. Mishti scheme is basically the mangrove initiative for shoreline habitat and tangible incomes, because it has been realized that these mangroves, they are important not only for the ecosystem services, not only for the biodiversity, but at the same time these mangroves are also very important for supporting the income level of the coastal community. Because greater the population of the mangroves, lesser will be the coastal erosion, greater will be the amount of fish catch, greater will be the availability of the various benefits of the mangroves as well. That is why the name tangible income has been associated. So it talks about comprehensively exploring the possible areas for the development of mangrove vegetation, and approximately 540 square kilometer spreading over 11 states and 2 union territories during the 5 years, these will be brought under mangrove vegetation. So this will improve the fight against climate change. These are the portions of current affairs, guys. Okay, so you have to when you are revising, Please do ensure that you revise these portions as well. Okay? Improve the fight against climate change. Then ensure sustainable income for coastal communities, and also provide a large scale coastal conservation. Coastal conservation in the sense conservation or protection from, let's say, erosion, the coastal erosion which is created, etc., and also support the marine and terrestrial biodiversity. That is why this MISTI scheme has been launched. Now, this will include the sharing of best practices on the plantation techniques, on the conservation techniques, that it is not only important to plant a mangrove, it is equally important to see whether they are able to survive or not, whether they are able to last for a longer duration or not. Management practices and resource mobilization. Now, here, whenever you take a look at any particular of these government schemes, I hope that you are aware about the modus operandi or the method of preparation for this. So any government scheme that you take a look into, you have to understand, you have to take a look into, for example, which are the areas where it is being implemented, what are the intricacies of it, and also whether public private partnership, etc., is allowed or not. So in the prelims, UPSC is asking these nitty gritties quite significantly. So whether a statement can be framed that mangrove conservation should be carried, or this MISTI scheme will be carried out only by the private players, or only by the state governments, or only by the central governments. So that is where you have to keep your eyes and ears open. So here public private partnership is envisaged, is envisioned. Okay. Now, here, by the way, Nicobar project is also a threat to mangroves. Yes, that is why the environmental clearance to the Nicobar project, there has been significant amount of objection which has been raised, and environmental clearance, and that was appealed in the Madras High Court, and that is why the project has been stayed. But then, in order to contravene that, in order to get across that, that is why the government has introduced the Forest Conservation Amendment Bill 2023, where, as per the amendment, the government has provided provisions that anywhere close to around 100 kilometers from the bordering areas, there will be an exemption provided for construction of critical infrastructure. Now, Great Nicobar project can be classified as a critical and strategic infrastructure because it will include a port which can be used by the Navy as well. So that is where, if this bill eventually becomes an act, that will pave the way for the clearance of the Great Nicobar project as well. Now, here, this MISTI scheme, which was brought in order to improve the fight against climate change. This is also a part of the global movement which is going on in order to conserve these mangroves. For example, late last year, you had a new alliance which was formed, and that was referred to as the Mangrove Alliance for Climate. Mangrove Alliance for Climate. This is what was referred to as MAC. Now, this Mangrove Alliance for Climate, this was initiated by which particular country? Are we aware of that? That which countries have launched this particular alliance? So this was launched by UAE, and Indonesia. And you have various different countries such as Australia, etc. They have also partnered into that. India is also a partner to this. But the founding or the basic founders of this particular alliance is UAE and Indonesia overall. Now, there is a reason why UAE and Indonesia are the founding partners. Understand the basic geopolitics behind it. So, why Indonesia here? Because when we talk about the region of Indonesia and the island regions around Indonesia, that is Java, Sumatra, etc., now in those areas there has been a significant and a large amount of various different activities which have, or the proportion of mangrove, corals, etc., that is very, very high. Close to around one fifth of the global mangrove population is situated in the region of Indonesia. Okay, so close to one fifth, that is 20%. If 20% is something which you will be able to recall in a better way, so use that, of global mangrove population is found in the region of Indonesia and the island regions. And this mangrove, it has got a great amount of diversity as well. It is not as if only one kind of tree will be growing. Mangrove also will have a lot of genetic diversity, just like in any kind of a plant. Take the case of, let's suppose, a rose plant. Now a rose plant will have various different types of varieties, various different types of roses are there. So similarly here also the genetic diversity is very high. Genetic diversity is very high. Now, if the genetic diversity is very high, what does that mean? That means it is more resilient, and it more resilient to climate change, the outside impacts, and also it means that it will be able to support large scale of biodiversity as well. So ability to makes it more resilient to threats such as climate change, and supports larger biodiversity. Okay. Now, by the way, this alliance was launched. This is something you should be aware of. This was launched in late of 2022, that is around November and December. It was eventually at the Conference of Parties, which was the Conference of Parties 27 for climate change. That was held at Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt, where you had the finalization of the norms of this mangrove alliance for climate. Now, why is it that UAE is involved here? Now, there are certain reasons. First of all, UAE had made a promise in Glasgow in December 2021. UAE had made a promise at Glasgow conference. That was the conference in order to combat climate change. UAE had made a promise to increase the area under mangrove vegetation, and UAE was some is a country which is following upon that, because mangrove ecosystem, if it grows in those areas, and it can grow in those areas, it will always provide a greater green cover that will be beneficial for those regions. Now secondly, while UAE was already following up on that promise, UAE, with the help of this alliance, simply scaled up its goal. It increased its goal. Why? because UAE is the going to be the chair of the Conference of Parties 28 for climate change. The COP 28 for climate change will be held in Dubai later this year. So that is where UAE is going to pioneer that. So that is where, when we talk about UAE, in order to support that, its earlier pledges made in the Conference of Parties 26 in Glasgow, and also to provide a kind of a leadership and a example of sorts. That is why UAE was instrumental here. Okay, so this is why you will find UAE to be instrumental. You have member organizations, member nations, these keep on increasing. So Indonesia or Australia, India are partners. There are more members which keep on joining. The promise made by UAE was to increase the area under mangrove vegetation. That was the promise made in Glasgow in 2021. So while it was already keeping up that promise, it simply decided to scale up on that goal. So imagine, for example, let's suppose you have already, you have, or you are holding a kind of a conference, you are holding a kind of a global summit. It will always appear to be good on your part if you are seen to be leading by example. So UAE basically, this is pledge to increase the area under mangrove. So that is the purpose of Mangrove Alliance for Climate, to combat. So when we talk about purpose, to combat climate change, right? So how will it be done? It will be done by increasing the area under mangroves, and also to conserve the coastal ecosystem. Because when you talk about UAE, now UAE has been under severe criticism for significant number of years almost, where it has been reclaiming large amount of areas from the sea. It has been reclaiming those, isn't it? So that is why, in order to create artificial islands, in order to create artificial structures, large tall buildings, skyscrapers, UAE has been doing that. So it would look good on the side of the UAE as well, when it is seen to be protecting the coastal ecosystem by increasing the mangrove vegetation. So that is one of the basic purposes behind it. Okay, now after this, so this is the again a part of your current affairs that you should be aware of. Then after this, we come to the marine aquatic systems, and there we understand. Now we had taken a look at the factors which end up determining the productivity of the marine aquatic systems. What are the factors? So factors determining the productivity. So what are those factors? You have sunlight, dissolved oxygen, also salinity, good. Any other factor which determines the productivity of the marine systems? Sundaresh, the use is understood, or is there a doubt which exists? Very good. It is temperature, the temperature variation. So these are the basic factors. So here, wherever sunlight is available, that is where you will have a greater amount of productivity. Why? Because wherever sunlight is available, the plants would be available and the plants would be able to carry out basic photosynthesis, and that would increase the productivity of biomass in the aquatic system. That is why the greatest amount or the greatest number of biodiversity, the largest scale of biodiversity which is observed, that is to be observed in the region where you have the presence of very shallow waters, that is in the region of continental shelf. Now here, at the oceanic water broadly can be divided into photic and aphotic zone. There is a kind of a transition region in between as well, but then you have the photic and the aphotic zone. Photic zone means that is the one where you have availability of sunlight. Availability of sunlight. And aphotic zone is under permanent darkness. No sunlight. Earlier, it was thought that at the bottom of the sea where there is no sunlight, obviously the plants wouldn't be there, so no species would also be to be found. Now, there was a greater research which started happening after World War II, and various different folk tales and folklores. Folklores and folk tales mean the folk stories which are very persistent, passed on from one generation to another. They started being heeded to, and people started paying attention to that. For example, in the region of Peruvian coastline or the western coastline of South America, there is a kind of a fish which is referred to as an oarfish. If you have ever taken a look at the oarfish, you would observe that they are particularly linear, they are very, very long, they have a kind of a transparent structure which exists, and these are around 6, 7 feet, or sometimes even 10 feet long. Now, these oarfish you don't find normally in water, in the sea water, but time and time again, these fishes would start emerging on the surface when they are about to die. So what the folklore talked about in the region of Peru, there is a folklore that whenever there is going to be a massive earthquake, these fishes, they come to the surface to die. Now, upon greater research, it was found out that while there is not significant amount of empirical evidence to indicate the same, but at the same time, there are many such species that we don't end up observing on the surface of the sea or closer to the surface of the sea, but which live in the dark bottoms of the sea. And those particular species, they are referred to as benthos. Benthos or the benthic species, which basically live at the base of the or at the lower portion of the sea. And various experiments were carried out, experiments in the tune of that certain amount of organic materials were left at the bottom of the sea, because if there is life, they would consume those organic materials. It was observed that large amount of these organic materials would be consumed within no time in the pitch darkness. So that is when people understood that yes, there are a lot of various different species that we even don't know. So these benthic species, they are the ones which live in the darker conditions. Dugong, no, dugong is not benthic. Dugong will always live in the continental shelf, and that too closer to the coastline. Why? Because these dugongs, they are feeding on the marine aquatic plants. So these aquatic plants you won't find in the aphotic zone, right? So these are the species to be found at the bottom of aphotic zones. Now, in this region of aphotic zone, the temperature is also low. You will have immense amount of pressure also. Pressure is very, very high. Because if you take a normal submarine that you see, the large, massive submarine, if you put it in the benthic zone at this particular depth of maybe 3 to 4 kilometers from the surface, they will be crushed like a tin can. That is how much pressure there is. So that is why these particular species, they have gone through a certain amount of adaptations. What are the adaptations? So when you take a look at the adaptations that they carry out, for example, they have very large eyes, very, very large eyes, in order to help them look through the darkness as well, in order for them to look into the darker conditions and diffuse light conditions. So they have large eyes. Then they have very hardened skull in order to withstand the high pressure. So they have very hardened skull. Okay. Then other than that, you will also end up finding many of them, they indicate bioluminescence. Many indicate bioluminescence. What is bioluminescence? Any of us? What is meant by bioluminescence? So certain species you will observe, they are able to produce light. Right. Very good. Shining body parts. So they are able to produce some amount of light from various different parts of the body. They do produce some amount of light. That is bio. So even when you take a look at oarfish, the oarfish also produces bioluminescence through the linear body that it has, the linear body structure that it has. So that is basically few of the adaptations. So few of the types of the sharks that you will observe, not the ones that you have seen in the movies or the images or the videos or the pictures. This is basically different varieties of sharks or fish. These are your examples of these benthic species. Dugongs are sea cows. See, Saurabh, basically nowadays in many of the regions, dugongs, or in many parlances, dugongs are referred to as a sea cow. Dugongs belong to a larger group of species which are referred to as manatees. Now these manatees, they are a larger species group where you have many different species under them, and these manatees, they are generally considered to be marine herbivore mammals. Now earlier you did have a particular species which was referred to as a sea cow, and that sea cow, from the moment that we discovered them to be found in the region of northern portion of Europe, we managed to put them into extinction within a span of 30 years by hunting them and also by degrading their environment. For example, presently you observe that when you take a look at the countries such as Norway, Sweden, Denmark, all these countries, even UK for that matter, all these countries nowadays, they are champions of climate change. Even if you, let's say, light up a fire anywhere in India, there will be some amount of protest, some amount of instigation coming from Norway that you are the one who are destroying the environment. Now Norway, Sweden, etc., you would have heard that they are very prosperous, the public services, etc., are very good. That was not always the case. It came after oil was discovered in the coastal areas. And once this oil was discovered, coastal degradation, the rate at which it was carried out in the region of northwestern Europe, that is simply unprecedented. That is something that the world has never witnessed, and the world will never ever witness again. And then the large scale hunting activities that they carried out, that led to the significant extinction of sea cows. So these sea cows which were found, they have been put to extinction by all of us. But then these dugongs, they are very similar in terms of body morphology, in terms of the diet that they consume. That is why sometimes you will find that they are referred to as sea cows, but they are, if you go by the technicality of it, they are different. Depth of photic zone, Janitha, is something different in different water body depending upon the presence of salinity or salt conditions, depending upon what is the type of water in terms of where is it that the sunlight is able to penetrate. But generally it is around 400 to 500 meters, or somewhere sometimes even around 1 kilometer from the surface. That is where you will receive some or the other amount of light. That is the photic zone. Okay. Now, here, temperature, salinity, depth, current, substrata, and tides near the oceans all contribute to the variation in the marine ecology. And it is split into photic and aphotic zone based upon light penetration. Marine environment accounts for almost 70% of the global surface. And that is why conservation of the marine ecosystem is very, very important for the conservation of the biosphere in general. Now we come across what is referred to as a coral reef. Okay. Now, these coral reefs, they are also what are referred to as the tropical rainforest of the aquatic ecosystem, also known as tropical rainforest of aquatic ecosystem. Okay. Why are they referred to as tropical rainforest? Because they end up playing a kind of a similar role underwater as is played by the tropical rainforest. So rather than aquatic, it would be more precise if we write here marine ecosystem. Okay. So why is that? Why is that? First of all, these corals, they will carry out, with the help of zooxanthellae population as well, they carry out significant amount of photosynthesis, or are responsible for carrying out large scale photosynthetic process. And in that process, they produce lot of oxygen which is dissolved in water. So they provide shelter, first of all, shelter to the algal species, that is zooxanthellae, right? Provide shelter to the algae, that is zooxanthellae, which carries out photosynthesis and enriches the water with dissolved oxygen. So, just like when we talk about, let's say, the presence of a water body or presence of a forested area. Now, those forested areas, they are always, in a way, provided an analogy to the lungs, isn't it? That you will breathe in and you will breathe out. So, there also, when we breathe in and breathe out, similarly, when we talk about the forest will take in carbon dioxide, provide oxygen. So, that is where they are referred to as the lungs. So, similarly, in the case of the corals, also underwater, now, majority of these corals, they have a symbiotic relationship or a mutually beneficial relationship with the algal species, that is zooxanthellae, and due to that, they end up producing significant amount of oxygen and consume large amount of carbon dioxide and remove carbon dioxide from the oceanic ecosystem. Other than that, they also provide shelter to large number of biodiversity. So because of both of these purposes, coral reefs, they are always referred to as the tropical rainforest of the marine ecosystem. Now, corals are also of various different types. You have soft-bodied corals, hard-bodied corals, you have shallow water corals, you have black corals. So, you have the black corals, for example, and then shallow water corals. Shallow water corals and black corals. Now, shallow water corals, they produce, or rather exist in a symbiotic relationship with zooxanthellae. Okay. Now, zooxanthellae is an algal species, and that algal species, if it is to be found, means what? In order to carry out photosynthesis, that algal species will require the presence of sunlight. It will also require the presence of nutrients. So that is why these corals, they are to be found in the shallow waters, right, where the sunlight is available. Then you have a species which is referred to as a black coral. Various different types of black corals, they exist at the bottom, exist in benthic zones, and in these benthic zones do not have the symbiotic relation. So how do they get their food? So in these cases, the black corals, they get their food by, for example, getting access, or they are basically filter feeders. So any floating matter, any floating organic matter which comes near them, they trap them with the help of the tentacles. So let us understand a bit more about the more dominant ones, that is the shallow water corals. Let us understand, what do we understand by coral bleaching, the conditions required for the growth of the corals, and why is it that bleaching happens. So this is a morphology of a coral polyp. So whenever you talk about a coral reef, for example, it is made up of hundreds and thousands and millions and billions of individuals. That is the coral polyp. Okay, reefs are made up of individual coral polyps, are made up of individual polyps. Reefs are made up of that. So this is what is your individual coral polyp. Now, if you take a look at the body morphology is very simple. You will have the presence of various different tentacles. Now, these tentacles, what they end up doing is they actually solve the purpose of any floating object, small biomass. They are trapped by the tentacles and they are ingested. They are ingested and put through the orifice or the mouth of the corals. This is the simple digestive tract. Now, these polyps, they synthesize the outside minerals which are dissolved in the seawater, and they are able to synthesize calcium carbonate out of it, and that is how they end up creating a calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So this is created by the corals as they synthesis the calcium carbonate present. Basically, in the seawater, you have calcium ions, carbonate ions, which are present. So they will synthesize calcium, they will synthesize carbonate ions, they will be able to combine them and then manufacture the calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So that is basically present in seawater. Okay, so that is how they create that calcium carbonate exoskeleton. Why? In order to provide them with a kind of a stability, a kind of a strength. Because when we talk about the marine environment, in the marine ecosystem and environment where you have waves, tides, etc., which are a commonality, it is very easy for these corals to get uprooted, to be moving from one region to another as well. So that is basically to provide them with a kind of a stable condition, a stability of environment. Now, after that, they don't get adequate food just by trapping the moving particles. So that is why the small nodules that you see here, the small nodules that you see, that is what is the algal species Zooxanthellae. Zooxanthellae is nothing but an algae. Okay, and this algal species is able to manufacture their own food, carries out photosynthesis. Now, when they are able to manufacture their own food, that food is also utilized by the corals as a source of nutrition. But what is it that the algae get in return? If it is a mutually beneficial relationship, what is it that the algae will get in return? The algae get a surface availability of nutrients, because the algal species, they also require significant amount of nutrients. Very good. So the algae not only get a surface to grow, but also availability of nutrients such as calcium, carbonate, etc. So these algae, that is why they get into a symbiotic relationship. Now, after this, when we talk about the growth, so the corals, basically when they grow, they end up furbishing a large calcium carbonate exoskeleton around them. And once they die, they leave behind that calcium carbonate exoskeleton. So the next species of corals will utilize the previous calcium carbonate and grow on top of that. The next species of corals will grow on top of that. The next generation of corals will grow on top of that. So that is how slowly and steadily they keep on coming to the surface. Now here, when we talk about these corals, what is the lifespan of these corals? Can we take a guess? How long will these corals be able to survive? What is the general lifespan? 2 years. Okay. In certain cases, the corals have been found to exist for thousands of years. Certain species of corals, they are found to have a lifespan of close to around even 5,000 years. Right? So these corals have a very long lifespan if they are allowed to grow naturally, if they are not hindered, disturbed, or they are not uprooted, they can grow for a substantial amount of time, from hundreds of years. Many species, they can grow for few hundred years. Many species can even end up growing for thousands of years. Okay, so that is a large lifespan. So now, that is how slowly and steadily they start coming closer to the surface. Lakshadweep is a coral island. Yes, Lakshadweep, Maldives, even some islands in the larger Andaman Nicobar, they are all, many of them are coral. So these corals, they start increasing in height. They start coming higher up. And they will continue to grow like this till they emerge out of the surface. The moment they emerge out of the surface, that is the surface of seawater, that is when these corals will die. Why? Because after all, these are marine species. They cannot survive outside water. And that is when they end up creating very intensive and very beautiful coral islands are created in the process. Now, when we talk about the conditions required for the growth of corals, we talk about the shallow water corals, because the deep water corals, they will have the similar conditions everywhere in the depth of water in the benthic zone. So we let's talk about the conditions for growth of shallow water corals, of warm water corals as they are referred to. For growth of warm water corals. What are the conditions which are required? Yes, temperature is one of them. First is availability of sunshine. Very good. Availability of sunlight. Why? Because the zooxanthellae need to carry out photosynthesis, and that is a source of nourishment or nutrition. So they do require the availability of sunlight. Hence, majority or almost all the warm water corals are to be found in shallow water conditions. Hence, to be found in shallow waters. Then, after that, consistent temperature. What needs to be the temperature range? The tropical waters ideally are in the range of 24, 25, or 26 degrees Celsius. So that is the temperature range which they thrive upon. Around 25 or 24 to 26 degrees Celsius. Okay. Then after that, what is the other requirement of these corals? So they require clearer, nutrient rich water. That is, they cannot grow where you have a lot of sedimentation or a lot of muddied water. Okay, so cannot grow where there is a lot of sedimentation or deposits. Because again, if there is a lot of muddied environment, lot of sedimentation which is carried out, the process of photosynthesis will be inhibited, isn't it? That process of photosynthesis will be altered significantly. That is why clearer, nutrient rich water is where you will find them. Then after that, and nutrient rich water, by the way, can fresh water be considered as a nutrient rich water? Let me know. Can we consider fresh water that you observe in rivers and lakes? Can we consider them to be nutrient rich water here? Good. Very good. Saurabh. So it is not considered to be a nutrient rich water. That is where you have the salty water conditions, saline water conditions, which are rich in calcium, carbonate ions, because they need that calcium carbonate exoskeleton to be built around them. So that is where salinity is essential. Very good. Is essential. That is why they will always grow in seawater. And then here, lack of pollution. pollution. Okay, so it is in these areas that you will find the growth of these warm water corals in large proportion, in large quantities. Now, what is referred to as a coral triangle? Any of us, are we aware of what is referred to as a coral triangle? Any clue about it, what it would be associated with? Temperature is the one factor due to which the coral is shifting. Yes, temperature, coastal encroachment, infrastructure building, pollution, all of these. So marine heat waves causes large scale coral bleaching. We had conducted a webinar this Thursday about the marine heat waves, and one of the impact of that is basically the shifting of the population of the corals. So any of us, are we aware about what do we understand by the coral triangle? So coral triangle refers to the region where you have a very, very large density of coral population. Almost one third of the corals are to be found in the region of Indonesia, Philippines, and Australia. Okay, so that is where in the Western Pacific and Eastern Indian Ocean, in the confluence of them, you have very large number of islands, and those islands, they end up providing the shallow waters. So coral triangle, so in the region between Australia, Indonesia, and Philippines, you find almost one third of the global coral population, warm water coral population in particular. So in the region between Indonesia, yes, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, all these, Brunei, in these areas, Philippines, Australia, the corals or the coral population is very high. Almost one third of global population. And here, it is not only the absolute number, it is also about the diversity. How diverse. And when we talk about diversity, guys, we will be introducing ourselves to the concept of the species diversity, genetic diversity, etc. So that diversity is also very, very important for the survivability of the species, because it can happen that, let's suppose, one type of coral is impacted by this. One type of coral, let's suppose, is impacted by the sudden onset of climate change or a kind of a disease. But the other types of species of the corals, if they exist, they can withstand that. So that diversity is also to be found in this area. Why? Because this is a region where you have a lot of these various islands which provides the shallow waters. You taught in the geography class, and it is good that you are able to recall that, because I don't have the expectation. In many of the cases, the expectation is whatever is taught in the geography class is forgotten in the geography class itself. So it is good to see that you are able to retain that. So here, that is basically where you have to interrelate as well. Now we come to the portion of bleaching of the corals. Okay, so we'll take a look at the bleaching of the corals after we take a break. So by the way, the first long break, your lunch break, will be from 3 to 3:40. So before that, let's take a break. And okay, I'll take a 15 minutes break here, and then we'll be back in 15 minutes. I hope that is fine. Okay. So let's take a break and be back. And then we'll introduce ourselves to what is referred to as cement. We have heard about CEMENT, cement. What is SEAMENT, cement? What is biorock technology, right? Also, we'll be introducing ourselves to what is cryomesh, and then the conservation of corals, and then we will be moving on into the portion of the biogeochemical cycles, which are very important for your examination of prelims. You have direct questions which have been asked from there. Okay, so let's take a break and let's be back in around 15 minutes. A confirmation about the audio, please, if the audio is clear and available. Thank you. So, as we were talking about the Coral Triangle, mention the countries of Coral Triangle. Okay. So, in the entire region, when we talk about the region from Indonesia, Philippines, Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, all of these, if you talk about the entire region, that is what is referred to as the Coral Triangle overall. Okay. So, Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Solomon Islands, even Timor Leste, Papua New Guinea, all of these will be included in the portion of the Coral Triangle. Okay, this is the regional spread. Now, after this, we come to the portion of coral bleaching. Coral Triangle, yes, it is a geographical area. Geographical area where you will find large scale presence of corals, and also please keep in mind not only large scale presence but also with a significant diversity of corals. Now, why is it that you find large scale presence of corals here? Because of the availability of very large amount of suitable conditions due to large number of islands, island regions which are prevalent, large amount of shallow waters which are created by these islands. So you have lot of larger regions of shallow water. Okay. Now, after this, we come to the topic of coral bleaching. What is referred to as the bleaching of corals? So we have seen that basically these corals, they end up having a kind of a symbiotic relationship with the algal species, that is the zooxanthellae, and that is where they exhibit that kind of a symbiotic relationship. Now, whenever an adverse condition appears, for example, significant amount of pollution, sudden rise in sea surface temperature, in the cases of sudden adverse conditions, the coral polyps, they expel the zooxanthellae. It is the zooxanthellae which provides the pigmentation and the coloration of the corals. Now, when there is an expulsion of all these various different zooxanthellae or the algal species, now that brings about a whitish coloration to the various different corals. And that whitish coloration is referred to as the bleached corals, because bleaching in general, whenever you carry out bleaching even in your day-to-day activities, now that bleaching is what, where you have a kind of a whitening appearance. So here the corals, they are restricted to a kind of a stony whitish appearance, a skeletal appearance, that is referred to as a bleached coral. Now, this bleached coral is something which is not able to handle its own requirement of food. So when you have a bleached coral, does not mean that the coral will die immediately. So that is when they are not able to handle, or they are not able to have the adequate nourishment, because the zooxanthellae is not there anymore. If the conditions revert back to the normal adequate requirement within, let's say, 45 to 60 days, the corals might repopulate, or the zooxanthellae might repopulate the corals again, and the normal sustenance will continue. But if, let's suppose, the conditions are not reversed within a span of 45 to 60 days, that is when we experience a large scale mortality. So here, when coral polyps lose their symbiotic algae, that is the zooxanthellae, that is when we have a nearly transparent stony skeleton of the corals, and that is what is referred to as coral bleaching. Now, bleaching reduces the availability of nutrients for the corals. Okay, availability of nutrients for the corals. And if the conditions revert back or revert to normalcy within 45 to 60 days, the algae repopulate the corals, or else otherwise it leads to mortality. Now, the death or the large scale mortality of corals, that is something which is very disastrous and harmful for the aquatic ecosystem or the marine ecosystem. Because remember, not only do they provide shelter to the large scale biodiversity, they are also responsible for carbon sequestration, that is the capturing of carbon dioxide. They are also in a way responsible for provision and generation of oxygen into the dissolved oxygen into the aquatic system, which is required and consumed by the various other species as well. So that is where the availability of nutrients, right? Now, this is where it is very, very important. Now, what are the conditions which leads to coral bleaching? Conditions leading to coral bleaching. What are the conditions which cause coral bleaching? First of all, sudden change in sea surface temperature. Temperature. Then after that, here we also have pollution. Marine pollution. This can be in the form of solid waste dumping. This can also be in the form of, for example, oil spills. Then after that, sudden variation in sea level. That sudden variation in sea level, which can be caused because of storm surges, more occurrence of thunderstorms, cyclonic events, etc. Now, that will end up creating an adverse condition and will influence the availability of light in a not a suitable manner, and that will impact the food productivity. Then, other than that, you also have diseases, zoonotic diseases. also kills the algae or the zooxanthellae. Then, other than that, unsustainable fishing, tourism, and fishing, including activities such as bottom trawling and so on. So, that is what also ends up causing this. So, example, bottom trawling. Okay. Bottom trawling is a methodology of fishing where you have a net which is cast from the boat and it simply rubs against the base of the ocean or the sea in order to catch any kind of species which might even be stuck at the base. In order to capture all of them, that is why bottom trawling is, or that is the purpose of bottom trawling. But what it ends up doing, it muddies up the environment of the water and it also creates uprooting of larger corals in general. Okay. Now, how coral bleaching affects the marine environment? So, coral bleaching basically, once if the conditions are not reverted, it will lead to mortality. And once you have that mortality which is caused, that means the corals when they die, they will not be able to provide adequate amount of oxygen. They will not be able to dissolve that excess carbon dioxide from the water, and then also eventually they will not be able to provide food and shelter for the large scale biodiversity of the marine ecosystem. So overall there's a large scale damage. Third point is sudden variation in sea level, which is created because of, let's say, sudden rise in water in the coastal environment in the region of, when we talk about due to storm surges. A storm surge is created because of a cyclonic event or a thunderstorm, now due to which, if let's suppose there's a sudden rise or a sudden fall in the sea level, the amount of light available for photosynthesis, that is impacted. Okay. Now, here after this, understanding this, we come to another portion, and that is what is referred to as the biorock technology. Biorock technology. Now, this biorock technology is a very, it is not a very new technique, but lately it has been used for conservation and repopulation and regeneration of corals, used for regeneration and repopulation of lost corals in a very short span of time. So this works on the basic principle of electrolysis. What is electrolysis? I'm sure you would have studied that in your basic sciences. That what do we understand by electrolysis? So electrolysis is where in a particular container you install certain electrodes in a solution. Okay. Let's suppose here you have a solution. Now, electric current is passed through this. Now, due to electrolysis, what happens is that you have materials which will start accumulating on the electrode, right? That is electrolysis in general. Now, the principle of electrolysis is utilized. Of electrolysis is used. Now, how is it that the principle of electrolysis is used in this case? So, for example, when we talk about seawater, let's suppose you have a seawater. Now, in the case of seawater, it is saline, it is salty, it will serve as the electrolyte in this case. Now, in that seawater, you have to basically install a kind of a wired mesh. A wired mesh is installed here. And very minute amount of electricity is passed through this. Very minor amount, not a very large sum, but minor amount of electricity is provided. Charge is provided. Now, once that minor charge is provided, then what happens? Then, in that case, let's say that charge is being provided here. Then what happens? So, in that case, calcium and carbonate dissolved in seawater accumulates on this mesh. Now, this calcium and carbonate that ends up forming CoCO3, forms limestone like CaCO3. This is what is also referred to as cement. Okay. That is what is also referred to as cement. Now, here, imagine that you have a condition where all this is having a development of that particular cement in a way. Limestone like formation across all of this. Now, on this cement, you introduce certain species of maybe damaged corals or any kind of corals. They are introduced on this. Now, then it is found that the corals repopulate this area at an incredibly high speed. Why? Because now the corals, they don't have to waste a lot of their energy in manufacturing of that calcium carbonate exoskeleton, because that calcium carbonate exoskeleton already exists. So this resembles the calcium carbonate exoskeleton. It resembles the calcium carbonate exoskeleton overall. Now, on this, corals are introduced and they grow at an exponential rate to repopulate the region. So this bio rock technology is utilized, is used in order to basically repopulate or in order to recover any of the damaged ecosystem, an ecosystem which has been damaged, in order to bring them back to normalcy. That is where this particular technology has been used or is being used. Across India also, you have this particular experiment being carried out across the various parts of the coastline. Introduced with zooxanthellae? Yes, obviously. Introduced with the presence of zooxanthellae. So that is your biorock technology. Now, in India, where is it that you find the presence of the corals? So you find the presence of the corals across the coastline, but not across the deltaic stretches. Across the Sundarbans Delta, Krishna Godavari Delta, Kaveri Delta, you won't find the presence of corals. Why is that? Because in the region of the deltaic stretches, you will observe or you will experience significant amount of deposits of mud and sediments. So that is why not to be observed in those particular regions. That is what is observed here. Okay. Now, in the region of western coast, you have across the Gujarat coastline where you'll find them. You have this to be found across the Malvan coastline in Maharashtra. You have this to be found across further southern portion as well. Across the island regions also, you find the presence of a lot of these corals. Now, after that, we come across to what is referred to as the biogeochemical cycles. What do we mean by the biogeochemical cycles? So basically, it is a kind of a regenerative cycle whereby the nutrients of the planet, in terms of nitrogen, carbon, water, phosphorus, sulfur, all of them, they are recirculated back into the system. That is what constitutes the biogeochemical cycles overall. Okay, so this is a kind of a regenerative cycle to recharge the various different nutrients, and the utility of the various different nutrients, when they are utilized, how they are returned back to the system. So the elements move through a cycle and is regenerative to the ecosystem. That is, nutrients utilized are returned back to the system. Okay, now they are basically classified into gaseous cycles as well as the sedimentary cycles. So when we talk about gaseous cycles are the ones where it is the atmospheric circulation and the atmospheric recharge which plays a major role. Okay, and sedimentary cycles are the ones where you have the role, larger and more substantial role to be played by the earth's crust and by the various different geological cycles. They play a greater role. Okay, so under gaseous cycles, you have carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, water cycle. So they are generally recharged by the action of the atmosphere and the atmospheric circulation, whereas sulfur, phosphorus, rocks, etc., they are recharged through the geological activities. Now, gaseous cycles overall, if you think about them, are much more efficient, are more efficient and carry out the recycling in a very short span of time. Okay, so basically more efficient and carry out. So this gaseous cycle happens very quickly. It doesn't take very long period of time. It can happen within a few years itself. Whereas when we talk about sedimentary cycles, oftentimes it can span for many hundreds or even few thousands of years. So this is not very, when we say more efficient means, if let's suppose 100 units are circulated, then almost 99 units will be recycled back. But when we say that they are inefficient, means if you are spending 100 units, out of that only 50 units or 70 units, they are recycled back. So sedimentary cycles, they are less efficient, take a very large amount of time. A very large amount of time. Okay. And they consume automatically a large amount of time in general because geological processes are involved. And this basically is also a key to sustainability, because if this recycling is not carried out properly, then basically the nutrient availability for the various different ecosystem services, for the various different types of biodiversity, they are also put at a large and a greater amount of risk. So if you want a kind of a sustainability across the entirety of the biosphere, across the entirety of the ecosystem, that cycling or that nutrient cycling is a is an absolute must. Now let us take a look at few of the examples of this biogeochemical cycle. So we start with the portion of the water cycle. So when we talk about a water cycle is something that all of us are aware of. All of us have looked at or have understood what is this water cycle. Water cycle is basically where the water that we all utilize. Now, eventually, where is it that we get that water from? From the rainfall, from the various different methods of condensation and precipitation. Now, that water which is gained, that accumulates on the surface, accumulates in the form of various oceans and seas. And from the various oceans and seas, they go and recharge the groundwater as well. They evaporate, and that evaporation eventually leads to condensation, formation of large cloud systems. Those cloud systems will bring significant amount of rainfall, and that is how the entire water cycle is formed. So it is about utility, recharge, and then re-availability. That is the aspect of the cycle. So that is your water cycle. And then when we talk about carbon cycle, so carbon cycle, for example, how is it that carbon is produced? So by burning of fossil fuels, that is the anthropogenic or human induced process. Then even when we carry out respiration, even by respiration we leave out or we actually expel a lot of carbon dioxide. All the species, they will expel carbon dioxide. Now that carbon dioxide is retained in the atmosphere, that is then consumed by the plants in order to carry out the process of photosynthesis. And when the plants carry out photosynthesis, they will consume that carbon dioxide. Many of these plants, when they die, they store that carbon dioxide, and that is available to us many years later in the form of fossil fuels as well. But that is how the entire cycling process takes place. Now that carbon dioxide which is produced in the atmosphere, that is also to be absorbed by significant amount of air water interface in the oceans. Almost 25% of the global carbon dioxide is to be consumed by the oceanic regions as well. So here, this carbon cycle, produced by respiration, consumed by photosynthesis, produced by fossil fuel burning, consumed by again photosynthesis or absorption of oceans, and that is how the cycle is completed. This entire image, if you just take a look at it, it is more than sufficient. You don't need to reproduce this entire complex image in the examination. In the examination, if this kind of a question is asked, just the basic depiction will be sufficient, that where it is consumed, where it is produced, even that basic depiction is more than sufficient. Then we have what is referred to as the nitrogen cycle. Nitrogen cycle is the recharging of the nitrogen. Now, how is it? So, first of all, the atmospheric nitrogen, or the nitrogen which is present in the atmospheric region, that is present in an inert state. Inert means it does not react readily. That is N2. Is it for mains? No, it can be asked for your prelims as well. The basics about this, about the gaseous cycle, sedimentary cycles, can be asked for the prelims as well. And it has been asked in the prelims, as we'll discuss in the PYQs. So here, that nitrogen is released whenever you have the burning of fossil fuels, industrial waste, etc. In all of that, nitrogen is produced into the atmosphere. Now, the atmospheric nitrogen, that is basically provided or is enriched in the soil by the process of nitrification or nitrogen fixation. You have many different microorganisms. These microorganisms will consume that, isn't it? The microorganisms will, in a way, attach that atmospheric nitrogen into the soil to be provided for the various different plant bodies in general. So that is where you have the nitrogen fixation, which fixes the atmospheric nitrogen into the soil. You have the various different types of electrical storms, for example, thunderstorms and lightning. They also, due to the presence of sudden increased heat, they are also able to fix that nitrogen into the soil. So that is how nitrogen is returned into the soil. Okay, so electrical storms, then volcanic activities, then nitrification process, all of them, they will provide the nitrogen back into the ground surface, whereby that nitrogen can again be denitrified by the denitrification bacteria, the denitrification process. Nitrogen is consumed by the plants and the animals as well. And that is when again that nitrogen in some form or the other is released into the atmosphere. So that is how the nitrogen cycling does take place. When we talk about nitrogen fixation, that is the ability to fix the natural nitrogen present into the atmosphere, into the soil. That is what is nitrogen fixation. So certain microorganisms are capable of fixing atmospheric nitrogen into ammonium ions. What are ammonium ions? NH4 ions. So that is ammonium ions. Okay, so they are done by the free living nitrifying bacteria such as aerobic acetobacter and anaerobic clostridium, and symbiotic nitrifying bacteria living in association with leguminous plants. So leguminous plants such as you have pulses, grams, peas, etc. These are leguminous plants. So these leguminous plants have certain or have the presence of these nitrifying bacteria. So, as well as blue green algae, they will fix the atmospheric nitrogen because the plants require nitrogen as a major nutrient, but they don't have the ability to simply capture that nitrogen from free atmosphere and consume it. So that is where these plants, what they are required to do is, or they can only consume this nitrogen in the form of ammonium ions, and that ammonium ions availability is provided by the microbes that you find in the soil or in the root nodules of these various leguminous plants. Then we have the phosphorus cycle. Phosphorus cycle is a long term cycle, takes a very long time. Okay, and also is carried out by geological processes. That is what we refer to as the phosphorus cycle. Now, in phosphorus cycle, the phosphorus, what is the availability of phosphorus? So phosphates are generally available in, which are trapped in rocks. And how is it that the phosphates are supplied? So our bones, sewage, the fecal matter, the excreta, the bird droppings or the animal droppings, these are traditionally very rich in phosphate. Now, once all of this phosphate is industrial waste as well, all this phosphorus or phosphate, when it is returned to the ground, it gets trapped within the rocks for a longer period of time. Now, these rocks, over a period of time, when they rise up above the surface or when they are exposed, that is when we extract the phosphorus, and that is how we utilize the phosphorus ever again. So, phosphate is present in sewage, in the various mining waste, in the presence of the various different bones, fossils, all of that. Now, that is the provision of phosphate that accumulates in the water on the surface, and then eventually it is trapped in the rocks, and the availability is given by the untapping of the phosphate from these particular rocks in general. Okay. Now, then we also have what is referred to as the sulfur cycle. Sulfur cycle is a recharge of the sulfur that we have, the sulfates that we have. So, for example, when we talk about the sulfur cycle, here you have the utilization of sulfur dioxide in general and also elemental sulfur. So, sulfur as a gas and sulfur dioxide is supplied in significant quantity whenever you observe, let's say, a volcanic eruption, burning of fossil fuel. All of these, they become sources of sulfur production, right? So sulfur dioxide in the atmosphere is provided by refining fossil fuel, burning coal, by mining and smelting industry as well, extraction process as well. Volcanic eruption is one of the major sources for provision of sulfur. That is why even today, in many of the areas, the sulfur is extracted from the active volcanoes, from the mouths of the active volcanoes. And then eventually, this sulfur is provided back into the ecosystem with the help of the acid rain, where it dissolves with water to form a dilute sulfuric acid to be returned back into the ground condition, into the soil condition, and even by decaying of materials, etc., and it is returned back into the soil. Now, this is considered to be a sedimentary cycle. Even despite of the fact that a lot of atmospheric processes are involved, still it is considered to be a sedimentary cycle, because sulfur remains trapped into the soil for a very long period of time, and it takes a larger amount of time in order to recycle itself. I hope this portion is clear. Now, after this, we move on into the portion of pollution. Now, the portion of pollution that we are going to cover, first of all, we are going to cover the portion of air pollution, the legislations associated with it, the various different aspects of air pollution. Why is it that, for example, in the northern part of the country, we have greater amount of air pollution? We will be talking about the sources of pollution. Then after that, we will be talking about the aspects such as acid rain. What are the impact of it? We are also going to talk about the ozone layer, the creation of the ozone hole depletion, the Montreal Protocol, the Kigali Amendment. All of that we are going to cover in this module. And then separately, we are going to cover in the other part of pollution, we are going to cover the areas of water pollution, land pollution, noise pollution. Okay, so for your prelims, what is relevant here? It is important to know about sources of pollution. We are talking about air pollution here, guys. Okay, so sources of pollution is required to be understood. Then legislations, then also reasons for concentration of pollution, then ozone hole and associated fact of Montreal Protocol, then Kigali Amendment, and also target set. that is relevant for your prelims portion, for your mains part. Here, you need to have an idea about the, again, reasons for concentration of pollution, solutions, okay, then Montreal Protocol, and then Kigali Amendment. These are the areas which are going to be relevant for your mains exam. Okay, so let us take a look at this topic one by one. So when we talk about the air pollution, now air pollution is something that we observe in the region of the atmosphere. And by the way, another area which is very, very important here, if I have to narrow it down, where questions have been asked, that is about photochemical smog, chemical smog, and ground level ozone. Here also it has been asked. Photochemical smog and ground level ozone. Okay, so from here questions have been asked as late as this year as well, last year in the mains exam as well. So these are your important regions to be covered. So again, air pollution overall that we experience. Now that air pollution is something which has caused significant amount of damage, not only to the people around, but also to the larger biodiversity. And that pollution is having large scale impacts in terms of movement of species from one region to another, availability of food sources, and so on. So when we talk about this air pollution, it has got it has got a kind of a disadvantageous effect and an impact on the larger biosphere. And this pollution in the portion of atmosphere, if you talk about that, where this pollution has got maximum effect, so this has got its maximum effect in the region of troposphere and in the part of stratosphere as well, when we talk about the ozone layer. So that is where it has got maximum impact. So here, maximum impact is where it is observed in the region of troposphere and also ozone layer in stratosphere. That is also where it has got a significant amount of impact which is created. Now, overall, first of all, let us take a look at the sources of air pollution. Now, air pollution in itself can be classified into two basic types. You have the air pollution which is observed outside in the surrounding, that is the outdoor air pollution, and the air pollution which is caused, which is created in the inside, that is your indoor air pollution. So that is your basic classification: outdoor air pollution and indoor air pollution. Now, outdoor air pollution is caused by the various different factors, for example. And for this, obviously, I always maintain, in order to understand the sources of outdoor air pollution, you don't need me to tell you that how is it that the outdoor air pollution will be caused. even if you have observed your surroundings, even if you have looked outside from your house, and in any part of the country that you are living in, you would already be aware of that how is it that this pollution is created or caused. So first of all, construction and road dust. Now, India, being a tropical country, is a warmer country, it is a hotter country. And the region to the north of Tropic of Cancer, that is particularly dry as well. Now, typically, if you take a look at those latitudes across the world, in our immediate neighborhood as well, you would observe that those areas are deserts, right? The northern part of the country, the region that it exists in, the geographical location that it exists in, you'll find that the Middle East is a desert. You will have the regions in Africa which are also a desert. You have certain regions in North America which are also a desert. So these are the areas which are typically very dry. Now, in India, it is a different matter that we do receive periodic rainfall due to availability of the monsoonal months and the monsoonal conditions. But nonetheless, significant portion of the country is going to experience hot and dry conditions. Now, whenever you have hot and dry conditions, the soil dries out so significantly that it gets reduced to dust particles. It is then emitted as dust particles, which are then inhaled by us. That is why when you will observe any vehicular movement on the roads as well, you will observe that a lot of dust is released in the process. So it is that release of dust which is ingested by us, larger particles, smaller particles, and that causes a long-term damage into the breathing system, into the and causes breathing problems such as asthma, bronchitis, and so on. So this is one of the major areas. And India being a developed country, obviously the requirement of construction is going high. It is very significant. Then we also have significant amount of vehicular emissions. Now, vehicular emissions and transportation sector in general, they end up contributing close to around 27% of the outdoor air pollution. Now, many of the vehicles that you see moving on the roads, now, those vehicles, they are so very old, older than many of the humans as well, and they are unfit to be moving on the roads. But obviously, because of certain or the other reasons, they continue to run and they continue to pollute. Now, these vehicular emissions, they will release various types of gases such as carbon monoxide, nitrous oxide or nitrogen oxides in general, sulfur dioxide, carbon dioxide, etc. And various different types of heavy elements are also released by the vehicular emission. Now, construction and road dust, that ends up producing significant amount of particulate matter, which ends up remaining suspended in the atmosphere. Particulate matter of the size of 2.5 microns, of the size of even 5 microns, 10 microns, etc. And based upon that, you have the classification as PM 2.5, PM10, PM5 as well. So that is basically what you encounter. Then you have biomass burning. In our country, you would have observed that we have a strange fascination with burning everything, isn't it? Anything that we accumulate, we burn it up. You would have seen it as a kind of a daily habit of many of the shopkeepers also, many of the shop owners, or in the case of large gardens as well. You would observe that once the cleaning process is done, all the waste is accumulated, and if we don't know what to do with it, we simply light a fire to it. We burn it up. Now, when you burn that up, that is, in a way, you might think that, okay, all the garbage I have burnt it. So my region is clean, my house is clean, my shop is clean, my region is clean. But then all that biomass that you are burning, that is going to produce very fine particles of carbon to the size of 2.5 microns, what you refer to as black carbon in general. Now, that is to the size even smaller than 2.5 microns in many of the cases. They remain suspended in air for some time and then they are inhaled by us. And that inhalation process causes infections, lung illnesses, etc. And along with that, this also produces black carbon, other types of materials such as nitrogen oxides, sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, etc. Black carbon comes into the category of PM 2.5. There are other particles which will also come into the category of 2.5. PM 2.5 here indicates that the size of the pollutant is 2.5 microns. That is what is indicated by PM 2.5. Then you have the industries. Now, industrial emissions, they are significant. Many of the industries, they don't follow the adequate norms in order to carry out the production process. And the waste gases that they produce, they have a significant amount of pollutant load. Then open waste burning, we have large piles of waste which is accumulated in various areas. You burn them, that also produces a kind of a similar product. Then brick kilns where you manufacture bricks, where you produce bricks. So that is something which is a commonality across almost all the plain areas. Now these will also produce very dark plumes of smoke. If you have ever observed a chimney of a brick kiln, you will observe that they produce very large, thick black plumes of smoke. So that is also dangerous. Then you have very old power plants in existence, power plants which are very, very old. Now they will also end up causing damage. So all these, they end up creating lot of damage, lot of destruction in the process. Okay, so industries, they contribute to close to around 52% of the pollution, transportation around 27%, and various different types of other anthropogenic activities, they cause this various other sources of pollution. When we talk about indoor air pollution, now indoor air pollution, which is created inside your houses, inside your houses, don't get a perception that inside our houses the air is very clean. No, inside the houses also, in the case of the indoor environment also, the level of pollution oftentimes is very high. So when we talk about that indoor air pollution, one of the reasons can be smoking. That produces large amount of effluents, large amount of toxicants, heavy minerals as well. Now, wherever you carry out cooking, for example, now it is not that the fumes emitted by your cooked food, that is a pollutant. No, unless and until you are cooking good food, that cannot be considered as a pollutant. Unless and until you are not burning the pan or burning the food, that cannot be considered as a pollutant. But what is the fuel? What is the source of energy that you are using? So still we have significant amount of sections of the population who do utilize cow dung cakes, who do utilize coal, who do utilize wood and other forms of charcoal in order to manufacture food, or in order to rather produce food. And that is basically a source of pollution. It is said that when you use, let's say, logs of wood and coal rather than a gas stove, it is equivalent to inhaling almost 20 cigarettes at once. That is the amount of smoke which is produced in the process. And you would have witnessed this. Wherever you would have witnessed, even in many of the rural areas, still it is carried on. If you witness the amount of smoke produced by the burning of these materials, it is almost impossible to stand in the same area. Right. Now, for this, the government has launched a scheme. And what is that scheme is referred to? In order to provide the LPG cylinders, in order to provide a cleaner cooking fuel. What is that scheme referred to? Any of us? Are we aware of that? Because that government scheme, you need to be able to list out as well. Very good, Sergeant. That is the Ujjwala Yojana. Ujjwala Yojana is for the provision of gas cylinders. Then poor ventilation and high people density, they can be considered together. So wherever you have a poor ventilation, the air is not allowed to pass through. it will cause pollution. And then high density of population, which is the commonality in almost all the parts of the country. Even in nowadays, even in rural areas, the population density is very high. So that also causes significant population, significant amount of pollution. Then you have freshly painted rooms. Now, whenever you decide to move into a new place, many of us, we insist that the room should be painted at least or one day before we move in, or we move in while the rooms are still being painted. Now, whenever you paint a room, that produces a lot of volatile organic compounds that also ends up producing certain heavy contaminants and toxicants such as lead. Now, all those various different types of contaminants and pollutants, they are basically going to harm the breathing process, the breathing system, and cause various problems such as bronchitis. Then the scented items, the various scented items, the sprays that also that you use, all of that, room fresheners. Then you have various different types of incense sticks, etc. Now all these that you use, they produce smoke which is very, very harmful in the process. So that is the scented items and the disaster that they cause. So the next time that you freely use the room fresheners and you spray it across the room, so they have many of the contaminants or many of the various gases which eventually end up damaging us. And then you have pet dander. What is pet dander? So, for example, when you have or when you house pets into a small area where you don't have proper ventilation, so the pets, they also shed their skin, they shed their hair, etc. For example, the dogs, the cats, the various varieties of them. Now, along with them, the small hair particles, etc., they can be inhaled by us. And it is not a deliberate portion done on this, a deliberate activity done by the pets or the deliberate activity done by us where we start inhaling them, but it is a kind of an inadvertent process. And once you inhale them, that can cause lung infections immediately and also in the long run. That is why always it is advisable that if you are having pets, always you should have a ventilated region. You should have a kind of an open space so that all the pollutants, they are dispersed, they are not accumulated in the same region. Then these are few of the sources of the indoor air pollution or few of the contaminants of the indoor air pollution. So that is formaldehyde, benzene, as well as toluene, or what is also methyl benzene or toluene. Both of them, they end up having significant amount of contamination. So formaldehyde, most of these sources, they are carcinogenic in nature. And when we say they are carcinogenic in nature, means they can cause cancer. That is why the name carcinogen. So they are carcinogen, they are colorless and flammable at room temperature, and various different household products and sprays, varnishes, when you freshly paint or provide a fresh polish to, let's say, your furniture, there also in many of them you have that formaldehyde. Then benzene, for example, it is again carcinogenic gas. Carcinogen again refers to ability to cause cancer. So it can contaminate food and water, tobacco smoke, fuel burning, exhaust from the gases. So all of that can produce lot of benzene in the process. When we say toluene, so toluene is basically found in paints, glues, adhesives, disinfectants. Now during the time of COVID pandemic, now, all of us, we were significantly scared because of the spread of that COVID pandemic, and disinfectants started being used in very large quantums. Very, very high quantums, disinfectants were used. Now, these disinfectants, the sprays, now they consist of significant amount of toluene, and whenever you spray it on any particular item, a lot of that is persists in the atmosphere or in the air around us, which we inhale immediately. That is why it was advised during the time of the COVID pandemic, which many of the people obviously did not follow. It was advised during the time of the COVID pandemic that once you spray any substance, first of all, cover your nose or the respiratory tract while you are doing it with the help of the mask. allow that to settle, provide a kind of a ventilation, and then enter that area. Otherwise, you are spraying it and then you are immediately breathing in that air. So you are breathing in the toxicant. So this is also carcinogenic in nature. So all of them will end up damaging your entire respiratory tract and respiratory system. Then we talk about the concept of the primary and secondary air pollutants. What do we mean by that? The primary and secondary air pollutants. So, primary pollutants, these are the ones which are directly produced from the source of pollution. Those are your primary pollutants, directly produced from the source of pollution. So, when we say a primary pollutant, directly produced from the source of pollution. Okay, that is what is referred to as a primary pollutant. Now, here example: carbon dioxide, or the source of pollutant when we talk about, so industrial emission, then waste burning, vehicular emission, etc. So here the examples of the pollutants can be carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, sulfur dioxide, nitrous oxides. All of these can be your examples. Now, when we talk about secondary pollutants, what is the meaning of secondary air pollutants? So, when you have the emission of the various pollutants such as carbon dioxide, monoxide, etc., into the atmosphere, as they stay in the atmosphere for a longer duration, they end up interacting and reacting with each other. And when they will interact or react with each other, that is when they will end up producing the third type of pollutant or another type of pollutant. So this is produced when the pollutants stay in the atmosphere. Any doubts that we have up till now, feel free to ask. Any kind of doubts that we have whatsoever. Pollutants stay in the atmosphere for a longer time and react to produce another pollutant. Example: ozone, that is O3, even sulfuric acid, H2SO4 that you have, nitric acid, right, HNO3, all of this which constitutes acid rain, that is your secondary pollutant. PM 2.5, etc. These are the small particulate matter which are released by, let's say, the condition of dust, construction activities, burning of biomass. So that is again going to come into the category of what? Primary or secondary. When we talk about PM 2.5, PM5, and PM10, they will come into the category of primary pollutant or secondary pollutant. What do you think? Very good. So that is where it will also come into the category of primary pollutant. So you have PM 2.5, PM 5, PM 10, RSPM, that is the residual particulate matter, suspended particulate matter, all of them will come under that category. Is that understood, or is there any kind of doubt which prevails? Because once we have done this, then we will be building it upon and trying to understand the various aspects of the pollutants. We are going to talk about the aspects of ground level ozone production, etc. As compared, primary is more dangerous, yes, but the secondary, that can persist in the atmosphere for a longer period of time. Okay, but also here you have to understand that this is pretty much variable from pollutant to pollutant and individual to individual. Okay, PM here stands for particulate matter. That is what stands for particulate matter. It is a part of primary pollutant. Okay. Yes, it is under the case of primary pollutants. Most of the primary pollutants, the how is it that these particulate matter are produced? By burning of biome. For example, if you have a difficulty in imagining what is this particulate matter or what does this black carbon look like, if ever you have had or seen an oil lamp, the kerosene lamp, or let's take the case of some kind of candle also. Now, in that, if you cover the top at some distance with a paper, you will observe a blackish portion which develops. And then when you rub it with your hand, that blackish portion accumulates on your hands. Mostly in the case of oil lamps, you will experience this. Or whichever vehicle that you are using, the scooter, the car, anything. Now, the exhaust turns blackish, isn't it? Now, after some time, once the exhaust has cooled, otherwise you'll burn your hand and the fingers. So if you run your fingers through the exhaust pipe, you will accumulate a lot of black substances on your finger, very powdery substances, right? Which are very, very small in size. That is your black carbon. The size of the individual particle is close to around 2.5 micron. That is your particulate matter. Okay, good. So now we'll take the lunch break, and we'll be back at around 3:40, 45, and then we will continue furthermore. Okay, so after that we will be delving upon the portion of the Montreal Protocol, what is Kigali Amendment, what is referred to as the ozone hole depletion, what is referred to as the photochemical smog or the ground level smog, ground level ozone. We'll talk about that after the lunch break. Okay.